My name is Harper Sterling. I am 33 years old. And by the time the final course was cleared at our family's extravagant Thanksgiving dinner, my father finally learned the hard way that a silent daughter is not a weak one. I had barely handed my coat to the staff when I realized that absolutely nothing in that sprawling Greenwich, Connecticut estate had changed. The air still felt too manufactured, too heavily perfumed, like everyone was holding their breath waiting for a curtain to rise on a play I had specifically chosen not to audition for. My father, Richard, stood near the fireplace, checking his phone with that signature, smug little smirk he wore whenever he believed he was the smartest man in the zip code. My mother, Eleanor, smiled with all the warmth of a marble statue, smoothing out invisible wrinkles in the tablecloth. My older brother, Carter, was already 2 glasses of expensive scotch deep, practically vibrating with the unearned arrogance of a crown prince waiting for his coronation. And my younger sister, Chloe, was busy angling her phone to make sure the crystal chandeliers perfectly illuminated her face for her thousands of followers, selling the illusion of flawless generational wealth. And then there was me. I just sat at the far end of the long mahogany table, watching the performance unfold. I had seen that exact look of supreme confidence on my father's face 100 times before. It was the armor he wore right before he reminded me that in the Sterling family, my voice was nothing more than background noise. But before I tell you exactly how I dismantled his towering ego piece by piece, and why that night ended in a silence so heavy it could shatter glass, I want you to do something for me. Drop a comment and tell me what city or country you are watching this from right now. I want to see just how far across the world this story of absolute calculated payback is going to reach. Dinner commenced exactly like every other holiday meal I had endured before my 7-year exile. There was the unnecessarily expensive catering, the forced, hollow laughter, and the kind of corporate small talk that sounded deeply sophisticated until you actually paid attention to the words and realized nobody was saying anything of substance. I ate quietly, giving nothing away. I wore a tailored charcoal suit that did not scream for attention, but cost more than Carter's entire leased sports car. They just did not know enough to recognize the craftsmanship. Right as the dessert wine was poured, the main event began. My father stood up, tapped his silver spoon against his crystal glass, and summoned his old, familiar, booming authority. The room snapped to attention. Even Chloe put her phone face down. He announced that after months of agonizing market pressure and grueling top-secret negotiations, he had made a monumental decision regarding Sterling Global Supply. He was not passing the CEO title down, he was not restructuring the board, he was selling the entire company. Then he dropped the second bomb, wrapped in a self-righteous speech about self-reliance and building character. He made it perfectly, painfully clear that none of us were getting a massive payout from this deal. There would be no golden parachutes, no executive board seats, and no trust funds padded with the acquisition money. He was selling his legacy to an outside firm that demanded complete operational control, and his family was effectively being bought out and cast aside. The reaction around the table was instantaneous and chaotic. It was exactly what you would expect from people who built their entire identities on unearned privilege. Carter slammed his fist on the table, his face turning an ugly shade of red as he demanded to know how his father could betray him after years of so-called loyalty. Chloe actually started to hyperventilate, sobbing about how she was supposed to maintain her lifestyle brand without the company credit card. My mother just stared blankly at her untouched plate, frantically trying to whisper at them to lower their voices so the kitchen staff would not hear. Everyone panicked. Everyone reacted. Everyone except me. I sat perfectly still, resting my chin on my hands, watching my father absorb their distress. He looked victorious. He believed he was executing one final masterful stroke of control over our lives. He thought he had authored the perfect ending to his own legend. When the shouting finally died down into a tense, breathless silence, I looked directly at him and asked a single quiet question. "So, Dad, who exactly is the buyer?" He straightened his tie, puffed out his chest, and smiled. "A highly aggressive, brilliant tech and logistics holding company out of Seattle. They are called Apex Vanguard. They saw the value in what I built when nobody else did. He was so proud of himself in that fleeting second. He had absolutely no idea that the brilliant, aggressive architect behind Apex Vanguard was sitting right across from him, sipping her wine and holding the deed to his entire existence. To understand why that specific name, Apex Vanguard, was the ultimate kill shot and why my father looked like the floor had just vanished beneath his feet, you have to rewind. You have to understand the suffocating, picture-perfect illusion I was born into and the exact reason I had to burn it down. Growing up in our Greenwich estate was like living inside a luxury magazine spread where nobody was actually allowed to breathe. The lawns were manicured with military precision. The mahogany walls were lined with portraits that whispered about legacy, class, and old money. Sterling Global Supply was not just a logistics business to my father, it was a religion, and he was its absolute, unquestionable high priest. He built the company in the late 80s, scaling it through aggressive handshakes, golf course diplomacy, and a ruthless demand for loyalty. But in my father's kingdom, loyalty only flowed one way, and your value was entirely determined by the role he assigned you at birth. Carter was the anointed savior. He was the firstborn son, blessed with broad shoulders, an expensive haircut, and that effortless country club charm that older businessmen often mistake for actual leadership. He was groomed to take over from the moment he could walk. The problem was, beneath the custom-tailored Tom Ford suits, Carter possessed the strategic depth of a puddle. He could charm a client over a 3-martini lunch, but he could not read a profit and loss statement without getting a headache. Chloe, the youngest, was the decorative distraction. She recognized early on that no one expected her to work, so she monetized her proximity to wealth instead. My mother, Eleanor, was the silent enforcer of this entire charade. She was a master at ignoring ugly truths, capable of sensing tension the moment it entered a room and immediately burying it under a fresh pour of Pinot Noir and a change of subject. And then there was me. I was the ghost in the machine, the anomaly, the middle child who asked too many questions and cared way too much about the unglamorous details. While my siblings were learning how to perform for high society, I was learning how things actually worked. By 14, I was writing scripts to bypass the security on our estate's network just to see if I could. By 18, I was obsessed with systems architecture and data analytics. I did not want to be a socialite. I wanted to build things. I graduated near the top of my class at MIT with a dual degree in computer science and operations research. I came back to Connecticut believing that if I just worked hard enough, if I was undeniably useful, my father would finally see me as an asset instead of an accessory. What I found inside Sterling Global Supply was a dinosaur bleeding out in slow motion. While the rest of the logistics world was pivoting to automation, predictive modeling, and AI-driven supply chains, my father's company was operating like it was still 1999. They were managing multi-million-dollar shipping routes using fragmented spreadsheets, outdated legacy servers, and reactive phone calls. They were hemorrhaging money through operational waste, missing delivery windows, and alienating modern vendors. I tried to fix it. I started at the bottom, working grueling hours in the data department. When Carter inevitably fumbled a massive client account because he forgot to check port congestion warnings, I was the one sitting in the dark at 2 in the morning, quietly writing a script to reroute our freight and save his skin. And who got the credit at the executive meeting the next morning? Carter, for his incredible under-pressure crisis management. My father would beam at him and I would sit in the corner, totally invisible. If I ever brought up modernizing our infrastructure, my father would hit me with that patronizing smile. He would say, "Harper, sweetheart, clients do not pay for fancy algorithms. They pay for the sterling handshake. Leave the heavy lifting to the men." I started to realize a sickening truth. My father did not ignore my ideas because I was incompetent. He ignored them because my competence threatened the patriarchal fantasy he had built his entire ego upon. To acknowledge my brilliance meant he had to acknowledge Carter's absolute mediocrity, and Richard Sterling would rather run his own empire into the ground than admit his golden boy was a fraud. But I was young, and I was naive enough to believe that undeniable proof could change a stubborn man's mind. So, I stopped arguing. I put my head down and spent 8 agonizing months coding a proprietary predictive routing and warehouse management system from scratch. It was a masterpiece. The data proved it could cut Sterling's operational waste by 30% and completely modernize the firm. I thought it was my ticket to finally earning a seat at the executive table. I had absolutely no idea that bringing that project into my father's glass-walled boardroom would be the single most humiliating day of my life. Nor did I know it would be the exact moment my family would choose to stab me in the back, forcing me to become the monster that would eventually devour them all. I thought the numbers would protect me. I thought that in a room full of cutthroat businessmen, mathematics, logic, and projected profit margins would speak louder than bloodlines and fragile male egos. I was profoundly wrong. The stage for my execution was the annual third quarter strategy summit. Every major shareholder, regional director, and top-tier client was packed into Sterling Global Supply's flagship glass boardroom overlooking the Manhattan skyline. The room smelled of expensive leather, dark roast coffee, and unchecked arrogance. This was my moment. I had barely slept for a month, fueled entirely by black coffee and the desperate hope of finally earning my father's respect. I stood at the head of the heavy oak table and launched into my presentation. I unveiled a proprietary logistics software I had built entirely from scratch. I showed them how it could automate their archaic supply chains, predict weather delays before they happened, and dynamically reroute freight to save millions. I did not just give them theory, I gave them a live demonstration using our own company's fractured data. I showed them a projected 30% increase in net margins within 2 quarters. For exactly 15 minutes, I commanded that room. I saw seasoned investors nodding in genuine awe. I saw a spark of pure greed light up the eyes of our most difficult clients. The architecture was flawless, and it was undeniable. Then my father stood up. He walked over, placed a heavy, patronizing hand on my shoulder, and smiled warmly at the board. He told them the software was a brilliant, necessary tool for the future of the company. I felt a brief, foolish surge of pride. Then he looked directly across the table at my brother. "I want to personally commend Carter for spearheading this initiative," my father said, his voice echoing off the glass walls. "Carter saw the bottlenecks in our warehouse divisions months ago. He designed the conceptual framework and tasked our data department, led today by his little sister Harper, to do the heavy lifting and code his vision into reality." The air instantly left my lungs. I froze, staring at him in sheer disbelief. Carter had not seen a single line of that code. Carter did not even know the administrative password to his own company laptop without calling it. But there he was, standing up, adjusting his custom lapels, and humbly accepting a round of applause for my blood, my sweat, and my sleepless nights. He even threw in a self-deprecating joke about how hard it was to manage technical staff. I refused to let it happen. I stepped out from under my father's hand and stated, clearly and firmly, that Carter had absolutely nothing to do with the architecture. I told the room that the project was my intellectual property, designed and built entirely on my own time, without a single directive from my brother. The boardroom went dead silent. The kind of suffocating silence where you can hear a luxury watch ticking. My father's benevolent smile vanished. His eyes turned to absolute ice. He looked at me not like a daughter, but like a deeply insubordinate employee who had just committed an unforgivable treason. He leaned in and spoke in a low, sharp voice designed to cut me down to nothing. "Harper, you are a clever coder," he said, his tone dripping with condescension. "But you are not a leader. You lack the temperament, the vision, and clearly the basic professional discretion required to sit at this table. You build the engines. Carter drives the car. That is the natural hierarchy of this business. If you cannot accept your place in this family, you do not have a place here at all." I looked around the room, searching for a single ally. Carter wore a faint, pitying smirk. My mother, sitting in the observers' chairs at the back, carefully examined her manicured nails, utterly refusing to meet my eyes. Not a single board member, not even the ones who had just been praising my work minutes earlier, spoke up. They all deferred to the king. In that glittering glass cage, the reality of my existence finally crystallized. I was never going to win. The game was rigged. I was only there to serve as the invisible machinery that generated the wealth my brother would eventually inherit. I did not cry. I did not scream. I did not throw a tantrum. Instead, a strange glacial calm washed over me. It was the absolute clarity of someone who has nothing left to lose. I calmly closed my laptop. I unplugged the encrypted hard drive containing the only functional prototype of the software. I dropped it into my leather bag, zipped it shut, and looked my father dead in the eye. "You are right, Richard," I said, stripping him of the title of dad for the first and last time. "I do build the engines. Good luck driving a car without one." I walked out of the boardroom. I did not just walk out of the meeting. I walked out of the building, out of the company, and out of their lives. I drove back to the Greenwich estate, packed exactly 2 suitcases of my own clothes, and left my company credit cards, my trust fund documents, and the keys to my car on the Marble Kitchen Island. I booked a one-way commercial flight to Seattle with the money I had saved in a private account. My family thought I was being dramatic. They assumed the cold reality of the real world would break me, and I would be back in a month, begging for my old job and my allowance. They had absolutely no idea that I was not running away to heal. I was retreating to the shadows to build a war machine. I was about to shed the Sterling name, reinvent myself as Jordan Vance, and meticulously engineer a trap so lethal, so deeply woven into the fabric of their own supply chain, that they would never see it coming until the jaws snapped shut. Seattle was a shock to the system. It was cold, relentlessly gray, and entirely indifferent to who my father was. I traded a sprawling estate with vaulted ceilings for a damp, 300-square-foot studio apartment in the industrial district, where the radiator hissed like a dying animal and the floors vibrated every time a freight train rolled past. But as I sat on a mattress on the floor, eating cheap noodles out of a styrofoam cup, I realized something incredible. I was breathing freely for the very first time in my life. The suffocating weight of the Sterling name was gone. I legally buried Harper Sterling. I needed a name that carried no baggage, no trust fund associations, and no gender biases in the heavily male-dominated tech and logistics world. I became Jordan Vance. Jordan Vance did not have a billionaire father to fall back on. Jordan Vance only had a laptop, an encrypted hard drive holding a revolutionary algorithm, and a burning, absolute obsession with revenge. Those first 2 years in the shadows were brutal in a way my family could never comprehend. I worked freelance coding jobs late into the night just to keep the lights on. But during the day, I was building an empire from the scrap metal of a dying industry. The logistics market was fragmented. Everyone was bleeding money because their systems could not talk to each other. I took the prototype I had presented to my father and I expanded it. I did not just want to build a routing software anymore. I wanted to build an omniscient artificial intelligence infrastructure that could orchestrate an entire global supply chain. But brilliant code is nothing without capital, and as Jordan Vance, I was a nobody. I needed a predator to fund my war, which is how I found Marcus Thorne. Marcus was an old-school Pacific Northwest venture capitalist. He was ruthless, notoriously difficult to impress, and had made his fortune betting on aggressive tech startups that actively destroyed outdated monopolies. I managed to corner him in the lobby of a downtown high-rise after tracking his schedule for 3 weeks. I had exactly 2 minutes before his security ushered me away. I did not pitch him a product, I pitched him an execution. I opened my laptop, showed him a live data simulation of regional freight bottlenecks, and explained exactly how my architecture could predict and solve those delays before a human dispatcher even knew they existed. Marcus looked at the numbers, looked at me, and asked, "Who are you trying to put out of business, kid?" I looked him dead in the eye and said, "Everyone who thinks legacy is a substitute for intelligence, but I am starting with a dinosaur on the East Coast." Marcus Thorne wrote me a seed check for $2 million the very next week. That was the day Apex Vanguard was born. We did not throw launch parties, we did not issue press releases, we operated in absolute stealth mode. This is where the strategy shifted from simple competition to a calculated, lethal infiltration. It was time to build the Trojan horse. I knew my father. I knew Richard Sterling was far too proud and far too stubborn to ever admit his company was failing, which meant he would never willingly buy software from a new, aggressive competitor. He relied on old handshakes and legacy vendors. So I decided to use his own supply chain against him. Apex Vanguard quietly acquired a small, struggling middleware company in Ohio that provided digital ledger services to commercial trucking fleets. It was a boring, invisible company that nobody paid attention to. I restructured their software and embedded the Apex Vanguard intelligence engine deep inside their code. Then, we offered this upgraded software at a massive, irresistible discount to a major regional shipping carrier called Osprey Freight. Osprey was one of Sterling Global Supply's most critical partners. They handled 30% of my father's East Coast distribution. Within 2 months of using our hidden software, Osprey's efficiency skyrocketed. They were moving freight faster, cheaper, and with zero errors. Suddenly, Sterling Global Supply, bleeding cash and plagued by the sheer incompetence of my brother Carter, could not keep up with their own vendor. Their outdated, fractured servers were causing massive bottlenecks for Osprey. Osprey gave my father an ultimatum. Upgrade your communication systems to match ours, or we take our trucks and our business elsewhere. Panicked, cornered, and desperate to keep the board of directors from finding out they were losing a primary carrier, my father did exactly what I knew he would do. He ordered his IT department to adopt the required integration software to appease Osprey. He signed a licensing agreement with a shell company based in Ohio. He had absolutely no idea that the shell company belonged to Apex Vanguard. And he certainly did not know that the moment his engineers installed that software onto the Sterling Global servers, he had just handed me the master keys to his entire kingdom. Sitting in my sleek, glass-walled office in Seattle, 1,000 miles away, I watched the firewall of my family's empire drop. The back door was wide open. I was suddenly inside their network. I could see every contract, every panicked email, every hemorrhaging account, and every desperate move my brother Carter was making to hide his catastrophic failures. They thought they had just bought a software update to survive the quarter. They had no idea they had just swallowed a digital poison pill, and I was holding the only antidote. I watched the data flow across my monitors, a cold smile spreading across my face. The trap was set. The beast was in the cage. Now, all I had to do was let them bleed until they were forced to beg the monster in the shadows for a buyout. And the secrets I uncovered in Carter's private files during that digital infiltration were about to make the slaughter so much sweeter. For the next 3 years, I did not just compete with Sterling Global Supply. I became its invisible warden. Every morning, before I even poured my coffee in Seattle, I would pull up my encrypted dashboards and watch the slow, agonizing death of my father's legacy playing out in real time on my screens. From the outside, the company still projected an image of untouchable East Coast prestige. My father still gave arrogant interviews to business magazines about the importance of time-honored logistics. Chloe still posted sponsored content from the deck of the company yacht. Carter still strutted through country clubs like a master of the universe. But the data flowing through my Trojan horse software told a brutally different story. The foundation of the Sterling Empire was rotting, and the termites were wearing custom-tailored suits. With my unrestricted, undetected access to their internal servers, I began to see exactly why their margins were collapsing so rapidly. Carter was not just staggeringly incompetent, he was a liability bordering on criminal. Carter, the anointed heir, the golden boy who could do no wrong, was bleeding his own father dry. He had set up a network of ghost logistics consultants, shell companies registered in Delaware that provided absolutely zero actual services to Sterling Global. He was padding vendor invoices by 15 to 20% and quietly funneling the overages into private accounts. He was using company funds to cover massive, undisclosed personal debts, bad private equity investments, and a lavish lifestyle designed to convince everyone he was a titan of industry. He thought he was clever, burying his tracks in messy spreadsheets and confusing accounting jargon. But to an AI architecture designed specifically to detect financial anomalies and supply chain waste, Carter's fraud lit up like a neon sign in a dark room. I did not interfere. I just sat in the shadows, meticulously downloading every forged invoice, every routed email, and every bank transfer. I was building a guillotine out of his own receipts. The profound tragedy was that my father could have caught it. If Richard Sterling had ever bothered to actually look at the raw data instead of just blindly trusting Carter's polished boardroom lies, he would have seen the embezzlement immediately. But his ego was his fatal blind spot. He refused to believe the son he had chosen over me could be a failure. So he simply ignored the bleeding balance sheets, blaming market fluctuations and aggressive tech startups for their missing capital. He had absolutely no idea that the aggressive startup he was cursing behind closed doors was his own daughter, tightening the noose from 3,000 miles away. By year 6 of my exile, the trap was fully primed. Apex Vanguard was no longer a scrappy underdog. We had grown into an apex predator, valued in the billions, quietly eating up the market share of every legacy firm that refused to adapt. Sterling Global Supply, meanwhile, was drowning. Their credit lines were maxed out. Their oldest clients were abandoning them for faster, cheaper alternatives. The board of directors, finally waking up from my father's spell, was threatening a mutiny. Richard was completely cornered. He needed a massive infusion of capital, or he needed to sell, and he needed to do it quietly, before the industry realized his company was functionally bankrupt and his stock price hit zero. That was when I sent in the wolves. I did not approach him as Harper Sterling, nor did I show my face as Jordan Vance. I used a proxy firm of ruthless corporate lawyers in Manhattan to submit a highly confidential, incredibly lucrative buyout offer on behalf of Apex Vanguard Holdings. We offered $53 million for total acquisition and absolute operational control. To a dying company, it was a miracle. To Richard Sterling, it was the ultimate ego-saving lifeline. He could spin the narrative to the press as a strategic, visionary merger. He could step down as a wealthy patriarch and never have to admit to his peers that he had driven his own ship straight into an iceberg. I sat in my office and watched the digital signature register on my monitor on the Tuesday afternoon right before Thanksgiving. He signed the term sheets. The deal was locked, legally binding, and ironclad. He had sold his soul, his legacy, and his family's entire future to a faceless tech corporation without ever once demanding to meet the CEO in person. He was so desperate to save his pride, he handed over his empire blindfolded. I closed my laptop, leaned back in my chair, and exhaled a breath I felt like I had been holding for 7 years. I booked a first-class ticket back to Connecticut and packed exactly one suitcase. The board was set. The pieces were hopelessly trapped. It was time to go home for the holidays and let my family finally meet the monster they created. Apex Vanguard, my father repeated, the name rolling off his tongue with a sickening amount of reverence. They saw the value in what I built when nobody else did. For a fraction of a second, the dining room was completely still. The crystals softly caught the light. The fire crackled in the hearth. My family sat around that opulent table, completely oblivious to the fact that the executioner was already in the room and the blade was already dropping. I reached into the inside pocket of my tailored blazer. I moved slowly, deliberately. I pulled out a sleek, matte black card case, extracted a single, heavy card, and slid it across the polished mahogany table until it stopped exactly in front of my father's plate. "I know exactly what they saw, Richard," I said, my voice barely above a whisper, yet it cut through the room like a scalpel. My father looked down, irritated by the interruption. He picked up the card. I watched his eyes track across the embossed silver lettering, Jordan Vance, founder and chief executive officer, Apex Vanguard Holdings. He stared at it. Then he looked up at me, his brow furrowed in a mixture of deep confusion and rising irritation. "What is this, Harper? Jordan Vance is the CEO. This is a pathetic prank. You do not have the clearance or the capital to be sitting at this table." "Jordan Vance is a corporate alias, Dad," I replied, leaning back in my chair and taking a slow sip of my wine. "It is a legal shield I created 7 years ago because I knew legacy dinosaurs like you would never do business with a young woman, let alone the daughter you publicly humiliated. The $53 million wired into your escrow account this afternoon? That came from my firm. The operational takeover documents you signed? They grant absolute executive control to me. You did not sell your company to a savior in Seattle. You sold it to me." Carter let out a sharp, barking laugh, shaking his head. "She is lying. She is clinically insane. Dad, call security and get her out of here. She probably printed that card at a FedEx store." "I did not just buy you today, Richard," I continued, completely ignoring Carter's outburst, keeping my eyes locked on my father. "I have owned you for 3 years. Do you remember the Ohio middleware integration you bought to appease Osprey Freight? The software that saved your East Coast contracts? Apex Vanguard owns that shell company. You installed my Trojan horse directly into your own mainframe. I have had absolute, unrestricted access to your entire digital infrastructure for 36 months. The color drained from my father's face so fast he looked like he might have a stroke. The arrogant patriarch vanished, replaced instantly by a terrified old man realizing he had walked straight into a trap. He knew enough about tech to know that if what I was saying was true, he was completely exposed. "You hacked us?" Carter demanded, standing up, his chair violently scraping against the hardwood floor. "That is a federal crime, you psycho. We will have you arrested before dessert." I finally turned my gaze to my brother, the golden boy, the heir apparent. "It is not hacking when the CEO legally signs a licensing agreement granting third-party diagnostic access, Carter," I said, my voice turning to absolute ice. "And you should be very, very careful about throwing around the phrase federal crime in this room." I reached into my bag resting on the floor and pulled out a thick, leather-bound folder. I tossed it onto the center of the table. It landed with a heavy, satisfying thud right next to the gravy boat. "What is that?" my mother whispered, her voice trembling. It was the first time she had spoken since the argument began. "That, Mother, is the real legacy of the Sterling family," I said. "Those are the bank records, the wire transfers, and the forged vendor invoices. You see, Dad has been wondering for years why the margins were bleeding out despite record shipping volumes. He blamed the market, he blamed the unions, but the rot was sitting right next to him." I looked directly at Carter, who suddenly looked like he was going to be sick. "6 Delaware shell companies, Carter," I recited, watching his soul leave his body. "Registered to a post office box under your mother-in-law's maiden name. 15 to 20% padding on every East Coast logistics contract for the last 4 years. You funneled $7.2 million out of your own father's company to cover your private equity margin calls, and that pathetic offshore gambling habit you thought nobody knew about." "She is making it up!" Carter screamed, but his voice cracked. He looked at our father, pure panic in his eyes. "Dad, she fabricated the data. She is trying to destroy me because she is jealous." "Open the folder, Richard," I commanded. My father reached out with a trembling hand. He opened the leather cover. The top document was a direct bank routing match between Sterling Global's accounts payable and Carter's private wealth management fund. It was undeniable. It was absolute mathematical proof of his son's betrayal. Chloe dropped her phone. The screen shattered against the floor, but she did not even look down. She was staring at Carter with pure disgust. My mother covered her mouth, a stifled sob escaping her throat as the carefully curated illusion of her perfect family disintegrated in front of her eyes. My father stared at the papers for what felt like an eternity. He looked at Carter. Carter took one step backward, putting his hands up in a pathetic gesture of surrender, his face pale and sweating. "Dad, I can explain," Carter stammered. It was just a temporary liquidity issue. I was going to put it back. You have to believe me." Richard Sterling said nothing. He slowly closed the folder. He looked older, smaller, completely hollowed out by the realization that his entire worldview had been a lie. He had bet his empire on a parasite and exiled the only person capable of saving it. He finally turned back to me. His voice was a raspy, broken whisper. "What do you want, Harper?" I leaned forward, resting my arms on the table, taking in the beautiful, devastating silence of the room. "I already have everything I want," I said softly. "But tomorrow morning, things are going to change, and you are going to listen very closely to how the rest of your lives are going to play out." The morning after Thanksgiving did not begin with screaming. It began with the cold, clinical efficiency of a corporate takeover. By 8 in the morning, my legal team from Manhattan had arrived at the Greenwich estate, sitting in my mother's formal living room and treating my family's home like a hostile acquisition site. I called Carter into the study first. He looked completely shattered, nursing a severe hangover and the crushing weight of impending ruin. He tried to beg, invoking our childhood, pretending we had some deep brother-sister bond that never actually existed. I cut him off and slid 2 pieces of paper across my father's heavy mahogany desk. One was a resignation letter citing immediate personal health issues. The other was a legally binding asset forfeiture agreement. He was going to liquidate his offshore accounts, sell his collection of leased sports cars, and hand over the deed to his Hamptons summer house to repay the $7.2 million he had stolen. His choice was brilliantly simple: sign them both right now, or I would hand the leather folder from last night directly to the Securities and Exchange Commission and the FBI. He signed. His hands were shaking so badly he could barely hold the pen. He packed his things and left the estate before noon. The golden boy, entirely stripped of his gold, banished back into the mediocrity he had always belonged to. Chloe's fallout was surprisingly different. When the news of the acquisition and Carter's sudden, highly suspicious departure hit the industry blogs, her carefully curated influencer brand suffered massive collateral damage. High-end sponsors dropped her, her engagement tanked. For the first time in her life, her last name was a liability instead of a VIP pass. But instead of throwing a tantrum, something broke inside her. A few months later, she actually called me. She sounded exhausted, but real. She told me she had moved into a small apartment in Brooklyn and taken an entry-level marketing job at a firm that did not care who our father was. It was a massive fall from grace, but it was the first genuine thing she had ever done. My mother, Eleanor, was the one who finally broke the silence she had weaponized for decades. She came to my hotel room in the city a week after the dinner. She did not ask for money. She did not ask for a position. She just sat on the edge of the sofa, looked at the floor, and admitted the ugliest truth of all. She had known all along. She knew Carter was a fraud. She knew I was the brilliant one. She had actively sacrificed my future just to keep the peace in a house that was already quietly at war. She apologized, and because it was the first completely honest sentence I had ever heard her speak, I accepted it. As for Richard Sterling, his punishment was far worse than bankruptcy or a prison sentence. I let him keep his pride, but I stripped him of every ounce of his power. He was given the new title of Chairman Emeritus. He kept a beautiful, empty corner office with his name on the door, but his security badge did not grant him access to the executive floors. He could attend public galas and charity dinners, but he could not make a single operational decision. He had to sit back and watch silently as I gutted his failing infrastructure, fired his corrupt old boys club cronies, and rebuilt the company into an unstoppable modern powerhouse using the exact technology he had once laughed at. For a man whose entire identity was built on absolute authority, public irrelevance was a fate worse than death. He had to live every single day knowing that the empire he built only survived because the daughter he threw away decided to spare it. 2 years have passed since that Thanksgiving dinner. I split my time between my headquarters in Seattle and the newly renovated Sterling Global offices in New York. When I walk through those glass doors now, nobody looks right through me. Nobody asks me to fetch coffee or leave the heavy lifting to the men. The business is clean, the margins are incredible, and the people actually doing the hard work are the ones getting the promotions. And that brings me to the real lesson of this entire story. Because if you are listening to this, and you are the one sitting in the shadows, watching less talented, less intelligent people take credit for your work just because they are louder or arrogant or born with better connections, I need you to hear this. Revenge that ends only in destruction is hollow. It is just anger. True, devastating retribution is when you do not just expose their lies, you build an undeniable reality right over them. Let them underestimate you. Let them laugh. Let them think you are invisible. And while they are busy performing for the crowd, you quietly study the architecture of their stage. Do not fight them in their arenas. Build your own empire in the dark. Because there is absolutely nothing more terrifying to a room full of arrogant, entitled people than the quiet person who finally decides it is time to speak. Keep building. Keep planning. And when your moment comes, do not just demand a seat at their table. Buy the entire building and show them the door.